Chapter 4. The tea rooms were part of a grand estate, or rather, they were part of what used to be a grand estate. These days, the Haberdash mansion was all shut up, apart from one room where Mrs. Haberdash lived with her dogs. Mrs. Haberdash ran the tea rooms from a mobility scooter behind the counter. She would sit there in a faded lace dress with antique earrings gleaming against her copper brown skin and grey corkscrew hair piled up on her head. Imogen and Mary sat in the corner of the tea rooms. They ate cake and drew in their sketch pads. Imogen was working on a portrait of Mrs. Haberdash's dogs. Grandma was talking at Mrs. Haberdash. Winifred was a fool to trust a male hairdresser, she said, leaning across the counter. I told her it was a ridiculous idea. You might as well ask your dogs to serve high tea. Mrs. H nodded, making her earrings rattle. Imogen tried to imagine the old lady's dogs balancing cups and saucers on their heads. Perhaps next time she'd draw that, but she'd had enough of sketching for today. She tried to get Grandma's attention, but Grandma was in full swing. I've finished, said Mary, holding up her drawing. Imogen narrowed her eyes. It was nearly identical to her own dog portrait. Grandma, Mary's copying me, cried Imogen. Grandma pretended not to hear. She carried on talking to Mrs. Haberdash. I told my GP that I'd already spoken to Bernie, and Bernie said that if I took 6 paracetamol, the problem would be gone in no time. Imogen directed a death stare at her sister and stomped out of the tea rooms. She marched across the car park, but Grandma's car was locked. Fine. She'd soak outside instead. She'd soak for the whole summer holidays if she had to. At least it had stopped raining. She looked around for a place to sit. There was a gate in the corner of the car park that Imogen hadn't noticed before. Friendly letters hung above it, saying, Welcome to the Haberdash Gardens. Less friendly letters were painted across the gate. No trespassing. Imogen wasn't sure what trespassing meant, but it sounded like fun. She glanced at the tea rooms. No one was watching. When she turned back to the gate, her moth was sitting on it, or at least she thought it was her moth. She bent down to get a closer look, and the moth stared right back. It is you, said Imogen, smiling. I thought the rain got you. The moth flew off the gate and into the Haberdash Gardens. Imogen tried the gate's lock. It had rusted and came off in her hand. Well, she thought, Mrs. Haberdash really should have had that fixed. She dropped the lock and stepped into the gardens. Wait for me, she called. The gate swung shut behind her.